Hey guys, so today I'm going to review this book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. So imagine that you're doing a experiment for a university, and at the end of the experiment you've been promised to be paid a certain amount of money, and let's say they promise to pay you $10 and they give you a check, and as you're walking out you realize that this check is for $100. Do you go back inside and say, I'm sorry, there was a mistake, it was actually supposed to be only $10, or do you keep going? Now imagine that you are in the same situation, but as they hand you the check, they ask, is this the correct amount of money? Yes or no? And once again, they don't know that it's actually $100. They still think it's $10. They're not looking at the check. Um, and do you say yes or no? Do you tell the truth or lie? So this study was actually done, not by Haidt, but it's cited in the book. And when they found that people who are asked the question tend to be honest, but people who are not asked the question just tend to accept the larger amount of money. What they really care about is plausible deniability. And in the case of the people being honest, even though it seemed like they were being honest, they were really worried about being caught in a way. They were really more worried about being caught. And a lot of our morals and moral behavior is actually like this. We are more hypocritical. We don't always behave in the way that we claim to want to behave. And a lot of this is because our moral judgments actually come from intuition. They're not reasoned out as well as we would think they are. When people are asked whether they like or dislike something, for example, they can usually come up with a yes or no very quickly. And if you're doing a brain scan, that's the part of the brain in response that is more active for intuition lights up very quickly. But then when you ask them the reason why they like or dislike something and they have to come up with an explanation, that is more arbitrary. That takes longer. So what Haidt is saying is these are just post hoc explanations, and he comes up with a lot of evidence in here about why that's the case. It kind of makes sense, you know, if you are a hunter-gatherer or an evolving uh, uh, animal out in the jungle or the savannah and you see a stranger, you don't necessarily have time to reason through whether this person is friend or foe, or you know what they want from you or don't want from you. You sort of have to make a snap judgment, or at least it's much more efficient to make a snap judgment based on what they're wearing, whether they're alone or with someone else, what the context is that you're meeting them in, what the expression they have on their face, and how they're carrying themselves, and um, so it makes sense. It makes sense, and this tends to be how people behave. So that's part one. Part two, he did a lot of surveys in different cultures about moral uh, questions and judgments that people make. And he sort of distilled the common themes of all of these judgments down to 6 basic elements of moral psychology. And these are care, fairness, liberty, authority, loyalty, and sanctity. And when you do these questionnaires on American subjects, those that lean more liberal tend to focus on care, fairness, and liberty, whereas those who lean more conservative are more balanced. They respond to all 6 of the moral principles. And so this gives the conservatives an advantage in rhetoric because they can appeal to all 6 of the moral principles in their rhetoric. Authority, loyalty, and sanctity, as well as the other 3. And Haidt compares this to, let's say you go into a restaurant and you notice that all that's being served is sweeteners. And the owner of the restaurant explains that, well, he's done a study on taste and realized that taste can be broken down into some components like sweetness, sourness, saltiness, savoriness, and so on. And sweetness is the most efficient. It gives you the most dopamine bang for the least calories. So he only serves sweeteners. Well, that's not right, right? I mean, you want to taste all the sort of flavors of the palate, right? Um, so and that's a problem with a lot of, according to Haidt, Western thinking about morality is that it's sort of unidimensional. It's morally monist. For example, when Haidt was first getting into the field of moral psychology in the 80s, um, it was assumed that all morality comes down to harm. Does it harm someone or doesn't it? If it doesn't harm someone, then nothing's wrong with that. And I admit that when I started reading this book, I thought that way. Um, and then there are another school of morality is the utilitarians from Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. He says, well, morality is the greatest good for the greatest number. You sacrifice one person to save 5 people. And then another form of moral philosophy is deontology of Immanuel Kant. He says, anything that you do, you have to do so that in a way that you can expect every other person to do it. The non-contradiction. Don't contradict yourself about your morality and your actions. But the problem with all of these, according to Haidt, is that they're morally monist. They reduce morality down to a single thing when it's not that simple. Okay, part 3. Here's where he talks about evolution and this thing called group selection, which was supposedly discredited in the 60s. So group selection is this idea that if you see a bunch of animals trying to cross a stream and you see one fall into the stream and get eaten, and while the predators in the stream are eating that animal, the herd of the other animals cross the stream. And you can explain this in 2 ways. Either that one animal sacrificed himself for the species, did an altruistic act, or some people claim that, well, he was pushed into the stream and didn't really have a choice. He was old and crickety, and they just sacrificed him for him. And so in the 60s, there a number of scientists said, well, we're thinking in a fuzzy way about this, and if we really look at examples in animal species, there's no such thing as group selection. Animals that seem to be behaving altruistically are actually, in fact, behaving in their own self-interest. Only it's not readily apparent. And the only exceptions to this are like ants and termites and bees, where the entire hive sort of behaves as a single unit, where the drones, serve the queen, and so on and so on, because they all have the same genes. But you don't have the same genes as your siblings, even, or your parents or children. So from a genetic standpoint, it's every animal out for themselves, and our seemingly altruistic behaviors are actually just explained by game theory, or something, or reciprocal altruism, and so on. So Haidt is saying, well, no, there actually is group selection. For example, when life evolved from one cell to 2 cells, the 2 cells joined together into an organism that they were sort of saying, well, we're cooperating with each other because when we cooperate, we can beat out all these single cell organisms. The problem with cooperation is really getting it started. If you can get cooperation started, then a group of people cooperating are more effective than a single individual. And so Haidt is saying, how do we get cooperation started in the human species? Is that we have morality. We have these mechanisms that sort of enforce by reputation people's altruistic and morally good behavior. And if someone behaves selfishly, they are punished. And that's the evolutionary explanation for group selection. And in that way, we are kind of like bees and ants, more so than deer or elephants or any other sort of animal. So yeah, so quite interesting. But caveat: this group only group altruism only applies within your group, so it doesn't apply to outside groups. So a very interesting book. Yeah.